I'd like to thank everyone for coming out this evening as we welcome Richard Reeves to our store. As many of you know, Richard Reeves is a highly acclaimed author and journalist. Having written 9 books and received numerous awards for journalism and literature, his stellar vita establishes him as equal part journalist and historian. He has crafted his literary career primarily writing books about U.S. politics and history. Simultaneously, he has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker. He was a senior correspondent for Frontline, and currently he is a senior lecturer at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. His latest book, Infamy, is the story of one of the darkest periods in U.S. history. Through extensive research and interviews with survivors, Reeves gives his reader an expansive and gripping narration of the relocation and internment of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II. Through this exploration, Reeves illustrates the tragedy that can occur when a nation confronts challenge with hysteria. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Reeves.
Thank you. And thank you for coming. As mentioned, most of my books have been on U.S. politics. I seem to write them in batches. I wrote 3 books on the presidency, and then I wrote, when Abu Ghraib happened, I wanted to write a book about what I thought America was and what the America we grew up in. And I wrote a book on the Berlin airlift, which was called Daring Young Men, about the men who had served in World War II, had 3 or 4 years of their lives taken, and then 2 years later got phone calls, and within 48 pilots, air traffic controllers, mechanics, within 48 hours were flying food and fuel into Berlin to the people who had been trying to kill them. This story is quite the opposite. When I looked into it, when I thought about what might happen if there was more terrorism in the country, and the event to look back on was what happened to Japanese Americans in 1941, 42 through 1946. But there is a history, not obviously slavery and the treatment of the Indians, but in fact that everybody here, except for Native Americans, came from someplace else and almost invariably were discriminated against in the country, whether it was the Chinese who were brought here to build railroads or the Northern Europeans in the high plains, the East Europeans who came to the slaughterhouses and mining and the steel industry, the Jews, Irish need not apply. And it seemed to me there is a pattern in our history that when these people came, and we didn't need them anymore, we thought they were not like us until they were us, until they were the people or the people who were in this room. And I think that that is the essence of our country. We're people of the present. We answer all questions, and that is not a bad thing necessarily unless you happen to teach history at a university, and students' perfectly acceptable answer these days is, well, I wouldn't know about that. I mean, Hitler, I wasn't born then. But however, there are strengths in that ability to do the most American of things, which is to move on. The things that drove what happened after December 7th, 1941, particularly on the West Coast, was a hysterical combination of fear, and the fear was real. We had been attacked, after all, at Pearl Harbor, of lies, mostly from the press, the Los Angeles Times, the Hearst newspapers, Walter Lippmann, who gave Roosevelt the cover to do a lot of this, racism. The racism was obvious and open on the West Coast, and as much as any other factor, greed. In 1940, 40% of the agricultural product of California was produced by Japanese Americans. And among other things, one of the things that drove the hysteria in the press, which politicians reacted to, particularly the villains in this book led by Earl Warren, but people wanted that land, and they wanted the Japanese fishing boats. The Japanese Americans had been doing well in the country, and suddenly a lot of very bad people, or a lot of people who did very bad things, saw an opportunity to grab their land, their houses, their boats. So I want to begin by saying that the first generation of Japanese who came to this country, the Issei, were not allowed to become citizens from 1924 to 1952. The Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924, which went all the way back to exclusion acts in 1790, disallowing citizenship for anybody but white men. And then within 48 hours of Pearl Harbor, the FBI had a list of Japanese, and then 2 days later, the Germans and the Italians declared war on the United States, and they also had lists for them. And between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese Americans, all men, all aliens, were arrested by the FBI, by the Army, and were taken to federal prisons around the country. In some cases, their families never knew they were never charged with anything. In some ways, in many cases, their families didn't know for 2 or 3 years where these men were. And the men were the teachers, the journalists, the businessmen, the priests, the teachers, who were the leadership of the Japanese American community then on the West Coast, in Washington, Oregon, and California. And they were, it was like a Rotary Club membership list, really. Anybody who had any prominence at all found them, if they were Japanese American, found themselves in jail. Then, as hysteria built up over the next 2 or 3 months, 2 months, there became more and more calls to round up all Japanese Americans. There were 120,000 on the West Coast, and 2/3 of them were American citizens. 2/3 of them had been born in the United States, and the Nisei, the second generation, were rounded up. If you had, as the Army regulation said, 1 drop of Japanese blood, they scoured the orphanages to find out if there were any people there with Japanese blood. If a Japanese had been adopted by a Caucasian family, they also were taken away. So that first came the FBI, which was breaking into homes across the West and sometimes in the East as well. There were many fewer numbers. If there were 120,000 Japanese incarcerated in what Roosevelt himself called concentration camps, they were low-hanging fruit in a way, because if the same policies were applied to the Germans and Japanese, we would have had to imprison 50 million people. A third of Americans at that time had some German or Italian blood. That doesn't mean that there weren't all sorts of exceptions and outrages on all sides. Ezio Pinza, who was the lead basso of the Metropolitan Opera at that time, was jailed. He lived in Bronxville in New York. His wife was American. 5 FBI agents came and searched the house and dragged him out of the house. As they were walking past the door, the last thing there was a letter written in Italian. And the FBI agent said, "Well, what's that?" And Pinza said, "Well, that's a letter from Verdi." And the FBI agent said, "Who's Verdi?" 5 months in Ellis Island, he'd still be there if it wasn't for that Fiorello LaGuardia's parents were also enemy aliens. And he finally got out, though he had a nervous breakdown. I'll divert from the Japanese. This is how they picked up Pinza. The second basso at the Metropolitan Opera told the FBI that Pinza was a personal friend of Mussolini and that he signaled to Mussolini each Saturday afternoon by changing the tone of his voice on the Metropolitan Opera broadcast. That's what hysteria did to people, but it almost all was aimed at the Japanese Americans on the West Coast. The Los Angeles Times, he gave me a very good review. Surprised me slightly because of what I say about them in the book, but the review said that if you judge the book by the quality of the villains, then this was the best book since Antigone. They didn't go so far as I wish they would have to compare me to Sophocles, which would have been nice. But the villains in this book are Franklin Roosevelt, who signed the order allowing the arrest. The way it was done was to call the West Coast, everything west of the Sierras and the Cascades, a war zone. And the government Executive Order 9066 allowed the Army to arrest and remove anyone within that area. Well, it happened they only removed people who were Japanese and Japanese Americans. And Roosevelt personally believed in the meetings and White House minutes that he believed in eugenics, what many people of his generation did, I suppose. But he was backed by this in the Smithsonian Institute, which also had exhibits on that. Roosevelt got it in his head that the problem with the Japanese was that they were aggressive because of the shapes of their skulls, and that it would take 2,000 years for them to develop as civilized people, the same as white people. Well, we know it didn't take 2,000 years, and it's easy to argue who were the civilized people in this case. It started with the press, really. It started with the papers on the West Coast, but it was quickly picked up by politicians, and most particularly by the Attorney General of California, who was named Earl Warren. And Warren sold, among other things, sold Walter Lippmann on the idea that because there had never been a single incident of sabotage in the United States or in Hawaii by Japanese Americans, that was proof that they were planning one huge planned uprising planned in Tokyo. The most famous cartoon of the day appeared in PM Magazine. There were many, but the one in PM Magazine showed hordes of buck-toothed, glass-wearing Japanese along the coast collecting dynamite and looking out to the Pacific with telescopes, and the caption was, "Waiting for the signal from Tokyo." The cartoonist's name was Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss after that. Edward R. Murrow, who was from Washington, traveled that state speaking at schools, saying that when the Japanese came to bomb us and rape our women, that they would, if you looked up, you would see the men in the planes would be wearing University of Washington sweatshirts. Roger Baldwin, who founded the American Civil Liberties Union, which is key to this story, forbid ACLU attorneys around the country, he wanted to protect Roosevelt, from mentioning race as being a factor in what was happening, even though many people in the country did not know what was happening, particularly people in the East. A coterie of young and kind of crazy young ACLU attorneys quit over this, and they were the people who represented both the Japanese Americans and the Latin American Japanese who were also brought to this country and put in the camps. There were, particularly in Peru, there were 6,000 Japanese living in Peru. U.S. military planes and soldiers were flown to Peru and to Ecuador and to Argentina to round up the Japanese there. And they did. They basically kidnapped them and took them to the camps. They wanted to use them to trade, either for American residents trapped in Japan or for prisoners of war. When the war was over, we tried to deport the Peruvians, saying they were illegal immigrants, that they had come into the country without papers. These young lawyers, particularly one named Wayne Collins in San Francisco, fought the fights that allowed the Peruvians to stay, and also that ruled that dropped the cases, treason cases against Japanese Americans. Again, they were never charged with it, but they were locked up anyway. But that all happened. The Supreme Court held up any decisions until after the 1944 election, because Roosevelt, who was running against Thomas E. Dewey, was afraid that he would lose Oregon, Washington, and California if that became an issue. Ironically, there were people who in private talked about what was happening. Depends on what you think they were talking about. John McCloy was the Deputy Secretary of War, one of the wise men. And when asked about doing this, he said, well, I'm a Wall Street lawyer. The Constitution is just a scrap of paper to me. And that is what happened in the Supreme Court as well, because although the three Japanese cases that got to the Supreme Court were decided in favor of the men charged or not charged, the fact is that the laws that made this possible still exist, and we could use them tomorrow, say, for instance, on Muslims. What the law was finally written to avoid mentioning anything about race, anything about Japanese Americans, the law says that if a war zone is created by the War Department, then now the Defense Department, that any residents can be removed by the military. Where the only residents removed, of course, were the 120,000 Japanese who were first taken, Americans of all ages. In addition to what they did at orphanages, there were any Japanese who happened to be in a hospital. Two soldiers were assigned around the clock to guard them until they died or until they were well enough to be taken in sealed trains to assembly centers. The assembly centers were basically racetracks and livestock exposition fairgrounds. The Japanese were put in stables. They lived in stables for the first 3 months while the Army built 10 relocation centers around the West, and eight around the West, 2 in the swamps of Arkansas. They were tar paper barracks that were built on plans for prisoner of war camps, so that in 12 by 18 spaces, 6 people and sometimes more were put there for 4 years. There was no indoor plumbing. There was all latrines, boards with holes in them a foot apart. Very difficult on women, too, who used to wait till late at night, although they'd be followed by searchlights, to go to the bathroom. There was 1 electric bulb in the barracks and no water, no cooking facilities. One of the results of all that was that the Japanese family structure was largely destroyed because of mess hall dining. A lot of the people who were in the camps, young people, had a great time. They could run wild for for the first time in their lives. They didn't have to eat with their parents. Family dining was ended. They stayed with their friends. And in the end, they built these camps into what were like small town Americans, even though they had as many as 18,000 people in them. But it became a landscape where people had never lived before. It was the most barren places in the country, high deserts and swamps where the people were held. And of course, they were told that it was being done for their protection. Although when they got there on sealed trains, they were taken across the country in trains that they could not look out and they could not open the windows. They did when they got there. They noticed the guard towers, the machine guns were pointed in, not out, and the tanks were pointed in and not out. So it was the first realization for many of them that they were prisoners. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry, which really meant 2 suitcases or a suitcase and a baby, and and from then on, particularly some people, businessmen and whatnot, who had organizations with white employees, could tolerate, at least financially, some of what happened. Most people, however, particularly in California, their bank accounts were frozen on December 8th. Therefore, they could not pay their mortgages. They couldn't pay taxes. Their land then was called abandoned land and was distributed by the state of California to white farmers, white fishermen, white businessmen. There are many cases of greatness among neighbors who protected the property of their former Japanese neighbors. But as a rule, most people after 4 years came back to nothing and came back to sleep in prisoner of war camps, real prisoner of war camps. Prisoners of war were treated better than the Japanese because the prisoners of war, of course, were white. There were a lot of German prisoners, a lot of Italians. They were allowed to go into towns. They were allowed to work around the towns because they were white. And many of them are still here, or their descendants are here, because the American men were gone, and the only men around some of these towns were Germans and Italians, and there was a great deal of intermarriage. And then once they had married an American, they were allowed to stay. The Japanese got none of that. So when they got to the camps, they went in. There was never any resistance. They felt they were fiercely patriotic. They thought this was their duty. At least that was what they thought at the beginning. Some of that changed. The only people in the beginning who really objected were Japanese American veterans of World War I, who often wore their uniforms to the camps, and several of whom in one town, Monterey, California, committed suicide holding their discharge papers or their decorations from World War I. That's the kind of place it was at that moment. And when there were, toward the end, there was resistance. There were riots. Tanks came in. People were killed. The most famous killing was of a deaf Japanese man who, these soldiers were kids, obviously, in the guard towers, looking out over the landscape, bored out of their minds in these places where the temperatures in the summer were 120 degrees, and in the winter would go as low as 30 degrees in places like Wyoming, 30 degrees below zero in places like Wyoming and Idaho. In the summer, the Japanese men would dig foxholes, as it were, under the barracks so the children, small children, could stay in them all day, because that was the only cool spot in places like Poston, Arizona, where 3 of the camps were located. But they did build societies there. To the point I want to tell about the one killing of this deaf man. Guards shouted at him to get away from the fence. He obviously didn't hear him. He kept walking. The guard shot him in the back and killed him. He was court-martialed, found guilty, and fined $1 for illegal use of government property, the bullet. So that was the penalty for killing an innocent man. The stories were never told. Most people in combat don't like to talk about it. Don't talk about it, especially their families. And that was true of the Japanese. The older Japanese never told the younger children what really happened until, ironically, the Black Civil Rights Movement in the late 60s and 70s, when their kids started to ask, what did you do during the war, Daddy? And then they began to organize. And by then, they were in a good. I'll skip to the fact that 30,000 Japanese Americans served in the U.S. Army and Air Force. The Navy would not take them in World War II. 18,000 of them were casualties. There were also, that was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in American per capita in American military history. There were also secretly, never known, that 6,000 Japanese Americans served in the Pacific as translators, interrogators, cave flushers, incredibly brave people. And there were only 6,000 of them because most of the young Japanese were not fluent at all in Japanese, if they spoke any of it. But these guys without weapons would go into caves. The Imperial Japanese soldiers would commit suicide rather than surrender. And these guys would go into the caves and talk them out, often because many of them were kibe, that is, people who were born in the United States, were American citizens but educated in Japan, and then when they came back to the United States, they were fluent in Japanese. So most of the MIS, as they were called, who were incredibly heroic in the Pacific without anyone ever knowing it happened, came back home again to their families who were in prison camps. I think I should probably end it about there, except to talk about how it wound out. Once the Japanese Americans organized, and by that was the young ones when they found out what had happened. At Little Rock High School, when the black kids went in under Army protection, the only people who went in with them were the Japanese kids, students at Little Rock High, who had come from the camps. Even when they came back, they came back to live in old Army camps, old prisoner of war camps, trailers, abandoned housing, the same barracks that they had been in. Dan Inouye, Senator Inouye, later Senator Inouye, was one of them. He lost an arm in Italy and won a Medal of Honor, but when he was coming home to Hawaii and passed through San Francisco, he was thrown out of a barber shop when he tried to, in full uniform, the war was over, when he tried to get a haircut. When the Japanese organized and began to tell their stories and began to collect oral histories, which are incredibly moving, and they're really the basis of this book, which follows characters through, the government, President Ford formally apologized in 1975 for what had happened, said it never should have happened. And then President Reagan and President Bush, the first President Bush, worked through Congress a remuneration of $20,000 for surviving. You had to still be alive in 1994 to get $20,000, which was a pittance compared to what had been taken from these people. And many of the people, when they received the checks, either tore them up or gave them to Caucasian neighbors who had protected their property. So that was how it ended, and I want to tell how it ended for Earl Warren, who, more than any other single figure, there's no doubt in my mind that his direct line from the incarceration of the Japanese to the Brown v. Topeka. Earl Warren was a religious man. He knew what he had done, and if I had any doubt while I was researching it, he rode the back of the Japanese to the governorship. And in California, they do oral histories, extensive oral histories on the governors. And a woman named Amelia Fry did the Earl Warren oral histories at Berkeley. And on the sixth day, she said, Governor or Mr. Chief Justice, I want to ask you about the events of 1942. And Earl Warren broke into tears, walked out of the room, and never came back. So that at least he felt the shame for what had been done. Thank you. Wait. Oh.
Hi. Two quick. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Two quick questions. One was, are you saying that nobody east of the Cascades or the Sierra Nevadas, Japanese, were interned?
No. No.
Was that very many people or very small?
It was a relatively small number of people. I don't know the exact number. Probably about 6,000.
And
most of the country didn't know. I mean, among the families that I spent time with were two people who went to Indianapolis. By the end of 1943, if you could get a job or a college would accept you, you were allowed to leave the camps if it was in the East. And this couple went to Indianapolis. She was a nurse. He was a certified public accountant. And they told me in 25 years in Indianapolis, all their friends were white. There weren't many Asians in Indianapolis. Not a single person they met knew it had happened. So most of the country did not know, and if they knew, it was from Army press releases and photographs, which made it look like it was a resort. And the Japanese were proud people, and so they would not let themselves be photographed as victims. They would wear their best clothes and sit there with their families. Two of the photographers at the camps, their workers in the book, were Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange.
Wow.
But their work was censored by the Army. And the soldier, if you look, the kids organized their own high school. The college students organized schools for the younger children. And they had yearbooks which looked just like any other kind of Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland American yearbook of the time, with sock hops and bobby socks and all of that. But the soldiers and the guns were always cropped out.
So one other thing that I always, because I watch these programs about this and always think about, I'm totally against any kind of imprisonment, and I like the Japanese folks. But and this whole issue about Roosevelt being guilty is, I would always wonder, well, how many Japanese didn't get killed or attacked by West Coast or wherever folks because of this? You know, did they actually save a lot of people from harm in these protected environments?
No.
No?
No. I mean, you mean in the camps themselves?
No, I'm saying if the Japanese had not been imprisoned
their houses
in the camps,
were
would they have been
burned
attacked
down
on the West Coast?
Their houses were being burned down, and shots were being taken in the night at them, or kind of Ku Klux Klan activity. I mean, one of the examples was the few who did try to go east over the mountains. There was a 2-week period in which they could do that. Were stopped at the borders of the western states by vigilantes, armed. They were spit on. The Japanese were regularly spit on in that period. And could not buy gasoline or water or food, and were turned back and ended up in the camps.
So do you think many lives might have been saved?
No. The saved lives was General Willoughby, who was Douglas MacArthur's chief of intelligence, said that he thought that the work of the 6,000 Japanese Americans in the MIS in the Pacific had shortened the war by 2 years and saved 1 million lives.
Wow, that's great.
Would you discuss the role of J. Edgar Hoover in opposing the deportations?
Right.
Because he was one of the few people.
I started and lost track.
I know you did. But
The only public person who condemned the roundup was J. Edgar Hoover. However, being J. Edgar Hoover, it's very hard to determine what was actually on his mind. He was a key player in a turf war with the Army, and the question was the Justice Department or the Army going to be in charge of security at home and in Hawaii? And the military won out, and that's really what J. Edgar Hoover was probably complaining about. But the FBI had put together. The FBI did run Hawaii. Japanese Americans were 47% of the population of Hawaii. Some were imprisoned because they were on these lists, but none were incarcerated in the camps because the economy of Hawaii would have collapsed.
I think he regarded the deportations as a reflection on the FBI, because the FBI had found no evidence of sabotage or conspiracy, and it was totally unnecessary from his standpoint to do this.
It was not only his standpoint. I mean, the president had the same information that J. Edgar Hoover had, and J. Edgar Hoover was saying these people are no threat. Right. Partly to confirm that, a lieutenant commander named Ringel, whose son was a reporter for the Washington Post, Ken Ringel, was fluent in Japanese. He had served 6 years in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. He recruited safecrackers from San Quentin who broke into Japanese consulates in the United States. And what they found there were directives that there was no point in dealing with Japanese Americans because they were fiercely loyal to the country, to stay away from them, but see if you could recruit Negroes and communists.
Is it true that Eleanor Roosevelt was against the incarceration of the Japanese?
Yes. Easter 1943. First place, she wrote about it in her column, My Day. Easter 1943, the president and his wife separately did tours. She went to 3 of the camps, and he went to several Army bases by train. There were by then Japanese Americans serving in the U.S. Army. Before Roosevelt came, they were rounded up, taken 10 miles outside the military bases, and locked in aircraft hangars until he was gone. What went on between them privately, I mean, they were a very complicated pair of people. Often she served political purpose by being against things he was for, and vice versa. But there's no doubt that her feeling about what was going on was genuine, although the fear was enough that her daughter Anna was living in Seattle, and there's a letter in the book where she tries to persuade Anna to move to the east because she thinks the Japanese invasion is coming too. There was one Japanese submarine between California and Hawaii. So there was never any real danger. The hysteria was such that they arrested a group of people, white people, in Northern California because some people had reported to the FBI that there was a meeting of Japanese admirals in the state of Oregon, and the Army raided, and it was a Masonic Club meeting with You have fancy hats and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Question over there, I think.
Hi.
Hi.
Did you have any chance to talk to individuals who were resistors in the concentration camps, such as those who answered no to that infamous
Right, the no-no
attitude,
boys.
and in some cases were separated from their families and sent to a
Tule
temporary
Lake.
camp like Tule Lake?
Right.
And looking back at it, how does their perspective differ from, say, those who served in the 4-4?
Well, there were two kinds. No boys had to do with the fact that before you could go into the Army, you had to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. And two of the questions were, are you willing to fight for the United States? Are you willing to renounce any ties to the Empire of Japan? Many of the young people answered that by, instead of yes or no, by handwriting in, I am more than anxious to fight for the United States if my parents are given their civil rights. For the older people, it was a terrible threat. First place, they didn't get much news. Many of them thought Japan was winning the war long after the Battle of Midway, which really was the turning point. But the older people, if they renounced that citizenship, would become stateless persons and could be deported anywhere. But the no-no boys, the people who wrote no-no, were taken to the highest security camp, which was in Tule Lake, California, where they were guarded by tanks, and several times the Army came in. There were two types of people. There were people who were genuinely, particularly older people, who genuinely were pro-Japan. But most of them were just people who refused to answer those questions. And as time went on, as the government realized this was a huge mistake they had made, and they wanted to try to empty the camps, they held those people long after the end of the war.
I realize the focus of your book is on the camps themselves, but could you talk about the principled stand taken by Governor Ralph Carr of Colorado?
Well, it cost him his political career. There was a meeting called of Western governors in Salt Lake City by the government to try to persuade governors and officials of the Western states to take the Japanese either as citizens or as prisoners. The governor of Idaho said, you bring one into my state and you'll find him hanging the next day. Only one governor, Ralph Carr of Colorado, said he would willingly allow camp to be built in the state of Colorado. There's a statue of him raised by Japanese Americans in Denver. He was a Republican, and he lost the next election based on that.
And took Japanese from other states, right?
And he had no choice.
Right.
I mean, the military brought them into Colorado. He was willing to take them in as people rather than prisoners, but the military decided they'd be prisoners.
I was wondering if you used the word hysteria several times, and I was wondering, in all the time you spent thinking about this and reflecting on it, could you explain a little bit more how we do understand that these men that we've thought of as doing decent things and thinking of themselves as quite decent people did these terrible things?
It was a war. I mean, they felt it justified everything, and they used the same language they use today. It was national security. The effort they made was to keep these decisions, or the way they were made, from the public. But there were people privately. The Attorney General, Francis Biddle, was against it privately, but he was a new man in the cabinet and was in awe of people like Henry Stimson and the president. And he decided he'd write a letter to the president and ask for an appointment to talk about it. This is all in private. And the president said he didn't have time for that. So would say, like Eleanor Roosevelt's letter to her daughter, that many of them were as afraid as ordinary people were and acted worse than ordinary people did.
In the East, I knew about it, although I didn't know how bad it was because I was at Swarthmore College, and I wonder if you write about the Quakers.
Oh, I did a lot.
Yeah.
Best people in the country.
Yeah.
The only people who really worked was the American worked to help the Japanese get out of the camps by lining up jobs for them or by getting them admitted to colleges, was the Americans' Friends Service, the Quakers. They were the real deal.
I remember as a young boy the extent to which the Japanese were being demonized in the press for their conduct of the war in the Pacific.
Right.
And how did that influence this situation?
Well, it certainly it didn't help. We were being fed information, true information, not all of it, about Japanese imperial atrocities in the rest of the world. The camps were being Americans were being demonized for the camps in the Japanese press at the same time in Tokyo, not here. But that went on to. There were many scandals all over the place. The Japanese were great farmers and and among other things, at the camps at Manzanar, at Amachi in Colorado, they grew enough food in the desert. I mean, they made the desert bloom to actually export it while they were being fed K rations left over from World War I. And the Denver Post found out, ironically, a Japanese American later became editor, Bill Hasakawa of the Denver Post, but they found out that the Japanese had raised their own turkeys and had turkey on Thanksgiving, which they celebrated like ordinary Americans, while ordinary Americans, turkey was rationed. So some of it, it was hysterical. I mean, the people acted illogically again and again and again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. My father was apprehended by the FBI in 1942 in March as a German enemy alien and spent 2 years in the camps. And I just applaud you for bringing this up. I know your focus is the Japanese, but to the day he died, he was
never charged.
A shameful thing. The family and most of the Germans there never spoke German ever again. When I spoke like you did at Valley Forge on the same kind of incident, I had people coming up to me, the government's going to get you, they're going to put you in jail. They are still afraid because one of the things when they came out of the camps, they were not permitted to speak of this. So,
right. Well, well, not only were they not permitted to speak of it, but they were shamed, usually, to speak of it. But the laws that made it possible still exist on the books. And Robert Jackson, the Supreme Court, said that they should deal with the constitutionality of it. They never did. And he said it's a loaded gun on the Constitution, and it still exists today. It was never changed. Yeah.
My mom wanted me to ask a question. She's right here. She was at one of the camps in Arkansas, Jerome.
Right.
And her parents were arrested after December 7th. Her mother, she spent much of her life trying to figure out why her mother was arrested, because there were apparently only like 19 women who were arrested. So she was wondering if you uncovered anything in your research that might shed some light on that.
On the fact that I worked with one of the women who was arrested. It was a very patriarchal society, And the one woman I know who was jailed, incarcerated, ran a novelty shop in Aberdeen, Washington. And the Japanese were buying a lot of timber from us, and they would come into northwestern ports, and they would go to her store. And that's why she was never charged with anything. She never did anything. And she was taken away by the FBI. Her family didn't know where she was for a year, and her children tried to run the shop until they were rounded up as well. And the people of Aberdeen would come into the store and smash everything to the floor and spit on the kids. Ironically, the man who planned the camps was from Aberdeen, an Army colonel, an truly evil man named Carl Bendetson, who later became Secretary of the Army and was decorated for his service. But he was the one who came up with the strategy that people would never be named. It would just be a war zone. Anyone could be removed. And as we know, it really was the Japanese who were removed, no one else.
I mean, she's been looking for a logical answer to why her parents were arrested. She filed Freedom of Information Acts, and I'm just wondering if there's anything you might be able to tell her to give her.
Well, I can tell her that her mother was innocent. I mean, nobody was charged with anything. They were just, and you can look forever and you won't find that she was not arrested, right?
Her parents were arrested.
Both parents were arrested. And what did they do? I mean, what was their business?
My grandfather was a principal at a Japanese school.
Right.
My
That's
grandmother was one of
why
the teachers.
that was an influential position. And he was on what I called the Rotary Club list. It looked like that's why he was arrested. Many Japanese Americans were principals, both of English-speaking schools and Japanese-speaking schools, and they were all arrested within 48 hours.
Well, she wanted to say thank you for writing this book.
Yeah. Yes, and I only knew until now of one. When I taken, I mean arrested and put in jail. Someone asked about how the hysteria and how information flowed. You asked in this. There was a prison in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was, and there were Japanese held there. It could have been your mother. It could have been anybody. And people don't remember this, but the Bataan Death March was not known about in the United States until a year after it happened, because the government decided that if they made a case about the Death March and the atrocities involved, that it would be taken out on American prisoners. It happened that most of the American prisoners, most of the Americans on that march were from a single state, New Mexico, and the New Mexico National Guard had been nationalized, federalized, and they were the soldiers in the Philippines, in the main. And so the public did not know the Death March had happened, but people in New Mexico had gotten the telegrams that their sons were dead. And people in Santa Fe marched on the prison where the Japanese were being held with guns. They were going to kill them. And the people running the place, both civilian and military, persuaded them not to do it because they used the same argument, which probably was true, that if you do this, they're going to kill that many more American prisoners. And the people went home.
As to the President Roosevelt's motivation for pursuing this policy, you mentioned his belief in eugenics. In your mind, is that the strongest reason why he did this? It's the reason he never considered not doing it. He also
talked about a plan to castrate German prisoners, so that it didn't. I don't know whether it was his main reason. He might have done exactly the same thing if he didn't believe these people were primitive. But I mean, there's no way to pin that down. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.